Plenary session, understanding and addressing infrastructure needs. I ask our next panelist to come on stage, and I will start with Mr. Shigefumi Kuroki, General Manager, Head of Global Infrastructures Investments, Development Bank of Japan. Thank you, Mr. Kuroki. Mr. Jean-Pierre Barral, Head of Energy and Digital Transition of AFD, Agence Française de Développement. Laurent Bouchillou, Co-Head of Infrastructure Finance, Société Générale. Michel Oudebine, the Chief Economist of the French Treasury again. And Matthias Wojtok, Head of Structure Finance for North, Central and Southeast Europe, EAB. And the panel will be moderated by Michel-André Vol, Head of Infrastructure Finance of HSBC France, an activity focusing on greenfield and brownfield transactions across such sectors as energy, mining, transportation, etc. Michel-André joined HSBC in 2005. Please, gentlemen, come on the stage and start and proceed. Thank you. Voilà, je vous en prie.
Okay, let's start. So thank you very much for your presence today and for attending our roundtable dedicated to understanding and addressing infrastructure needs. So why this topic? We are living in a time of major changes and disruptions, which are clearly impacting the way we approach and the way we finance infrastructure. We see infrastructure needs becoming more complex, more hybrid. Energy transition, smart cities, smart mobilities are a good example of this trend. So we have a panel today which I'm sure will be the opportunity to illustrate our capacity to collectively understand what's going on and our capacity to put in place the right financing solutions. So I'm very pleased to welcome on this to this panel Mr. Oudebine, who is the Chief Economist of the French Treasury that you heard this morning. Matthias Wojtok, who is heading the structured finance team of EAB for a very large part of Europe. Mr. Kuroki-san from Development Bank of Japan. Laurent Bouchillou, who is heading the infrastructure team of Société Générale. And Mr. Barral from Agence Française de Développement. So we will start with you, Michel. To set the scene, I mean, the first topic of our panel is understanding the new infrastructure needs. The French state has always, played a key role, and you explained that again this morning very clearly in, setting the agenda. So we would be very interested in hearing you on, what are the priorities for the French government when it comes to infrastructure, your priorities in terms of sector, geographies. And what are you doing to foster the development and the deployment of infrastructure?
Well, thank you. Good morning again. I think that it was stated by a previous speaker that we already have a very high level of infrastructure in France. So probably, maybe the first message here is probably the aim of the French government is not that much to increase dramatically the level of investment in France, but to improve the investment and do better. And the key issue here is really here to select the best as possible the investment that will improve the everyday life of the French people. That's why the government is trying to convey a pipeline of projects that will be as comprehensive as possible. And Also, what I think seen from the Ministry of Finance here, what is really important also to be able to finance it beforehand. This is, of course, very important in two ways. One, of course, to be coherent with the public finance of the country, but also to give a clear pipeline to the private sector, will give visibility to the private sector so that you can adapt your firms or your way of reacting to this pipeline. These two ideas will be at the core of the next mobilities programming bill that will be released by the Ministry of Transport, Elizabeth Borne, in the coming weeks. I can give you maybe three elements that will be at the heart of this future law. The first one is the one I just mentioned, which is to be able to present really the first truly multi-year infrastructure programming for France, meaning that you will have for each year the cost and which projects will be started. To present it a very clear pipeline of the major transport projects and securing also the financing, which again I think is really key. The total amount was actually presented a few weeks ago by Madame Borne. It was already said previously something like 30 billion euros. The second key element of this law will be to try to rank the infrastructure projects and the timing to realize them, and notably working on what was done by an independent body which released this report at the earlier bit this year. It was the Infrastructure Advisory Council. And the last message, probably of this law, is that it will shift the attention from very new big projects to more everyday life, maintenance, modernizing, extending at the margin existing infrastructure. So this is probably the three main elements in the transport sector. It was already mentioned that there are also other elements in the agenda. I think notably of the broadband network that we are planning to extend. It was mentioned by a previous speaker to all the population before 2022, and we are starting also on the 5G mobile norm in the coming quarters. Maybe I don't know if I have some minutes left or.
Yeah, you can continue.
I can continue. Okay, that's fine. Maybe I can, on this agenda on investment per se, what is important to say that the government is also dedicated to improve the environment of where the environment, this investment will be conducted. It was also mentioned by our Business France colleague. It's very much about human capital and reforms in order to make the French economy more attractive and functioning as well as possible with labor market reforms, tax reduction, notably the corporate tax, and an agenda of simplification. When talking also about the private sector and the public sector partnership, France has tried along the years to improve its toolbox. We had, it was in the some decades ago, the concession model that we used quite extensively. Then afterwards, in the early 2000s, we introduced a government pay PPP with private financing that could be extended to projects without paying end users. You can have in this field things like universities, city lights, among others. In 2014, we introduced a scheme that is called the Société d'économie mixte à opération unique. Yeah, sorry for the acronym. CEMOP, maybe, I don't know, which is a complement of the institutional PPP tools. And in the recent years, we tried to look very carefully at the legal framework. I think about modernizing concessions, looking at the standard public procurement laws, regulatory frameworks to better adapt changes in the industry practices, but also in the financing instruments that are used here in France. I can quote here some of the realization, which is the creation of the Société de Libre Partenariat, which is a limited partnership, and the modernization of the regulation of loans granting to funds and so on. So I really think that we've done a lot in terms of modernizing the tools that are available to finance infrastructure as a whole, and it has been a long process. These tools most of them are already in place for a long period. That's why it was already mentioned, the team here in Paris are very experienced, either in consulting, bidding, and also in the financing industry. And maybe I will finish by a mention on green bonds, just to say that the government is also trying to be at the forefront in this field, with both private and public mobilizing on this direction. For the French state, we introduced, I think it was a premiere for a first sovereign green bond of reference size earlier, a year ago, something like that, of a green bond according to international standards with very high reporting standards. And on this field, you have also French firms going forward. I can quote notably in the field of transportation, SNCF Réseau, which has published its first impact reporting in 2017. SNCF Réseau, sorry, is the company which is in charge of managing the French railway network. Maybe I stop here for what we do to improve the environment and set the scene for infrastructure in France.
Okay, thank you very much for this introduction. I will now hand over to Matthias Wojtok from the European Investment Bank. Matthias, your institution and you personally have been, always very instrumental in favor of the development of new techniques, new sectors for EIB. It would be good, I think, for the audience to understand, what is next in your view. What are the priorities for the bank going forward in terms of sectors, geographies, and trends.
Many thanks, Michel-André. Well, I think, first of all, I need to say that we're a bank. So a bank has a limited role to play in infrastructure. We finance that, but we are not able to build it, actually. Now, EIB is though having a particular role in European infrastructure. And I think the biggest driver of our recent activities in the field is the so-called Juncker Plan, so the European Fund for Strategic Investments, so also called EFSI. So here you have like a target agreement where, according to a need in investments, the bank, together with the member states and the Commission, set up a program trying to improve the investment climate in Europe. So that is something which is of course a hard target for a bank of induced investment of 315 billion. I think there's a lot of people, including some of the main drivers behind it, they thought it's quite a challenge, it's quite a risk actually. Now, 2 years later, 2.5 years later, it turned out that we succeeded doing that, and that we are even topping it up. So we, until the end of this multi-annual financial framework, we are probably going to reach roughly something above 500 billion of induced investments with our financing. The idea of inducing that is, of course, not through delivering the standard products of the EIB, so standard low-risk loans, but to go where we make a difference, to go where we catalyze private investments into these infrastructures. And of course, infrastructure is an important role, even though it's not everything. So under the FC, we have all sorts of targets, but infrastructure, in particular transport infrastructure, and on top of the agenda, energy infrastructure, is a very important target. Now, Michel-André said quite rightly, I mean, we were involved in setting up a couple of innovative features, and I think we are still pushing to fine-tune our toolbox. That is, I think it's a very important thing, especially that a development bank with the visibility of EIB attracts criticism, is sometimes quite cumbersome, and we of course need to adapt to market trends. And if and when possible, I think it's our mission to precede market trends to basically open ways, and to bring people into particular infrastructure projects. That is not an easy task, because we are living in a world of complete over liquidity in the markets, and we have banks, institutional investors driving into these fields. So we need to be complementary, we need to be smart, and we need to be useful. First of all, we need to be useful to our shareholders. That's quite clear. That's the European member states. And I think the most of our financing in infrastructure involving private parties, let's face it, that is project finance, PPPs, that is energy infrastructures, is now targeted in getting the right volumes, getting the right risk levels through our instruments. And that, of course, builds on smaller innovation, I would say, on our product line. But they are targeting the seamless integration of an EIB financing in finance documentations for this type of projects. But in this environment, I think we are pushing also for, I mean, we of course see trends. I mean, we see trends, of course, I mean, in technology sectors, we see trends. So in the broadband communication scheme, where there's space for EIB to actually come up. But I think one of the most important analyses is that you see that you have a construction industry, which is more or less global. You have a finance industry, which is also more or less global. We have players that are involved in these transactions from all sorts of angles and who are highly experienced in that. Now, if you want to induce more investments in a very inhomogeneous field like Europe, you also need to recognize that the procuring authorities, they are local. They are local. They are relatively small in most of the cases. We don't have that many mature markets that are actually that have a good track record of attracting private capital to infrastructure. France, Germany, UK, of course. I mean, this is prime examples. You have top markets like Holland, who are extremely performing. But I mean, as a matter of fact, you see a huge need of getting advice from smaller procuring authorities who do one deal every year, maybe one deal every 2 or 3 years. So Eastern Europe, Southeast Europe, these are fields where the bank really propped up what we call our advisory services, designed to make things happen, help procuring authorities to bring their deals up, and in trust advance, knowing that there is a potential financing behind. I think that is these two things, optimizing finance capacities, plus this role of being the honest broker between procuring authorities and the market, is one of the most important aspects I wanted to underline here. Thank you.
Thank you. So this demonstrates that you can do a lot of things, Matthias. I will now hand over to Mr. Kuroki from Development Bank of Japan. I think it is the first time, well, it's only the second Paris INFRAWEEK, but it's the first time we have a representative from a Development Bank of Japan at this session. So I think it would be very interesting for the audience if you could explain, what your institution is doing when it comes to infrastructure. And of course, what is your interest, if any, for Europe and France in particular? What is your strategy? What is your agenda for this part of the world?
Thank you very much. So I'm very pleased to be here among the very great panelists. And then I'm Shige Kuroki, General Manager and Head of Global Infrastructure Investments of DVJ. So as a starting point, DVJ is a bit unique institution in that we are originally established by Japanese government after World War II to provide the long-term growth capital to Japanese corporate or provide long-term financing to infrastructure developments. But as the economy gets matured, our mission has been changing over the time. So since 2008, when we are corporatized, we are pretty much operating the business on a commercial basis, although we're still putting a lot of emphasis on addressing public interests and also achieving social positive impact throughout the investment as a DNA of the bank. So that's a brief introduction. And then in terms of our bank's role activity outside Japan, particularly in Europe, by leveraging our experiencing as a project financing lender in Japan, we are typically participating as a project financing transaction alongside the bank in Europe. But at the same time, we are also unique in that we have ability to invest in equity. So as opposed to the commercial bank, we are pretty much focused on equity investment as well, like a development agency, and then to make sure that we can bring the dollar value to our client. Oh, by the way, when we talk about the client, we are not necessarily talking about Japanese client only, but also we are obviously bringing a lot of value to non-Japanese client as well. And we have a lot of good contact with French companies currently. And then, but in addition to traditional activities alongside industry client, we are also considered the institutional investor as a great sort of important segment of our client currently, because we have a lot of the Japanese money which is sleeping, coming from a Japanese public pension or local private corporate pension fund. Therefore, the other initiative is to make sure that we can bring some sort of a Japanese investor coming by making a co-investment alongside with them, or sometimes we're making the asset management or projects through our asset management subsidiary. So there's two different business we are doing currently in Europe. And then talking about sort of a theme or agenda, we are particularly concerned or interested in Europe is probably, I have a twofold. First is characterized by the fact that Europe is obviously center of the innovation in infra space. So one easy example, which is probably boring and very popular in Europe, is the offshore wind farm transaction, which is very popular in Europe. But the government is trying to make it happen as a new sort of alternative source of energy as a part of energy transition. But because of the geographical challenges and the partly lack of a knowledge or experience in doing so, we haven't had any investment yet in Japan. So this is something we have to learn from Europe, how we analyze the skill or how the government implement the policy. This is something area we can learn from you. And then the other interesting area we often see recently is for example, interconnector between UK or Europe or some EV, energy vehicle, sort of a charging platform, which I often see very interesting. But at the same time, which is a more negative side, but from the non-European investor, we often consider Europe is the area of the concern of the political uncertainty a little bit. So even if you talk about the last few months, we come across a number of discussions such as which probably less relevant for this discussion, but the Swedish government trying to substantially reduce the capital costs of the electricity distribution company, and which greatly impact on the investor. Or sometimes the Italian government is trying to revoke the concession, and then which create a lot of uncertainty. And then that's obviously concern for non-European investor like us. So this is something we would like to more understand what's happening by cooperating with the European investor like yourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting to see your interest for our continent. I'll now give the mic to Laurent. Laurent Bouchy, you're leading the infra team in SocGen, so you represent the commercial banks in this panel. From your perspective, what are the next frontiers for a bank like SocGen? What are the trends you see, and if you can tell us more about it?
Okay. As a starter, I'm going to say I agree with what Matthias said, which is we have to remain modest. Financing is only part of what's needed in infrastructure. However, I think that, as you mentioned, Michel-André, and it's no news to anyone here, we live in a changing world, and in that environment, it's all the more true that I think banks can and should play their part, commercial banks, but not just commercial banks. I think it's also a collective effort. And from a commercial bank's perspective, it's probably true to say that we are in a move where probably we're going to keep playing our part, but not possibly to the same tune as we used to play it for a long time. And just to illustrate a few of the main trends that I think are very relevant to explain why we think that it's important that we, as banks, keep making all the efforts to understand and address the needs. One of the key trends that has been observed over the past years and will continue because it's an acceleration is in relation to the fact that it's a very European phenomenon, but we've been moving from a bank-only market to a market which is much more hybrid in nature, where banks and institutional investors have progressively learned how to work together and moved to a world where today infrastructure finance is not just a bank balance sheet issue for European banks, but it's much wider than that. And so that's one, I think, key trend, and that will continue to accelerate. There is another movement within the infrastructure world, which is with respect to the expansion or the broadening of what is eligible to infrastructure finance. I think we've moved to a world where there was a list of traditional asset classes, transport or social infrastructure when it's under a PPP, for instance, to give a few examples, which have been for ages done under infrastructure finance, to a world where, as the world changes, we've been able to apply infrastructure finance to new asset classes. Michel referred to the broadband program, fiber optic program for the non-densely populated regions in France. And what we see now is that as that program, which has been very successful, that has been moving beyond France, first thing. And second thing, it's also new generations of projects which may not apply the same recipes as those that were used in France, but will keep calling on liquidity and capital towards infrastructure investments. Give you a few examples, pushing it to possibly the more exotic end of the infrastructure spectrum. We've been, for instance, financing land registries privatization in Australia in the form of infrastructure finance, which is a bit hybrid. But hybrid, yeah. It's an asset class for all sorts of reasons, which lends itself to this type of financing as well. Another key trend, we think it's very broad, but it's not only impacting the infrastructure sector, but it's everything which has to do with social environmental sustainability. We see it trickling it down through everything that we do, every project, and that's, from a financing perspective, it's also a trend that we are taking on board in the way how we think around financing infrastructure. One, and that's the last trend that I picked out of my list, is in relation to the fact that probably we see a trend where there are less massive jumbo single projects where needs, as Michel referred to, are increasingly much more directly related to population needs as opposed to more macro approach. A number of sector or subsectors where the infrastructure solutions are much more granular, which is another challenge from an infrastructure finance perspective, and that we need to take into account as well. And there are a number of examples in that respect. Now, in terms of new frontiers, I think from sector's perspective, I refer to new asset classes. There's everything which has to do with the digitization of the economy, and that spreads much beyond broadband fiber networks. There are also anything which is related to energy transition and energy infrastructure, which, to pick a few examples, when it's about electrification of Africa, all sorts of off-grid solutions, which require financing, but a very different form to what's been traditionally done in project finance for infrastructure. In terms of geographies, from our perspective, it's very important to accompany our clients and the projects where they are. As we know that the more developed countries are already pretty well equipped in terms of infrastructure, clearly from our perspective, there's going to be an increasing focus, although it will remain selective for all sorts of reasons, towards supporting projects in much further boundaries, and emerging markets is clearly where we see at this point in time there's a huge need. We don't need to speak about numbers, but there's a gap. No perfect solution has been found, but I think collectively, again, there's a lot of tools that can be put together to actually make those infrastructure investments happen in those new frontiers. And then the last word on financing, I think it's very quickly, I think it's a move from, say, standard off-the-shelf approach to something which is much more bespoke, tailor-made to all those changes to infrastructure, which we need to take on board and find the right case-by-case solution.
Thank you, Laurent. No, it's very clear, and I think you've given good examples of this new generation of projects, much complex, much hybrid, much smaller sometimes, which will require to a clear update in our approach. Jean-Philippe Barral, you're in charge of energy and digital transition at Agence Française de Développement, so clearly the top priorities of the bank. From your perspective, I mean, you're very well placed to see the trends that Laurent has described. What is your take on this on this new generation of projects and the way an institution like AFD could help in developing them?
Thank you. First, a few words on the AFD group. This is the French DFI in charge of providing development finance in emerging and developing countries. We are active in more than 19 countries. So AFD is dealing with sovereign, municipalities, and government-owned entities. And Proparco, our private sector arm, is dealing with the private sector. So AFD has put fight against climate change as one of its highest priority, and we currently have our objective is to have 50% of our activities as with climate co-benefits. So it's not only about emission reduction with, of course, renewable energy, smart transportation, energy efficiency. It's also about adaptation, so water management, irrigation to make regions more resilient to climate change. A few words on the energy transition, which I think is a good example of how things are changing and making it more challenging to finance. So the energy transition is going through the transformation that is captured as a 3D. First, energy is more and more decarbonized. So renewable energy is now the main source of energy, and new capacity will be mainly based on renewable energy. It's more and more decentralized. So you have now in France, compared to 15, 20 years ago, where you had less than 100 producers, now you have 400,000 producers, people, industries with rooftop. So a challenge to manage all these production centers, and more digital, because the grid needs to become smarter to deal with intermittent energy and also to deal with all these points of production. So in this context, you have, I think, three challenges and that are lying ahead. First, on financing new generation capacity, which is more and more decentralized, much smaller. So you still will need to finance the large offshore wind farm, but you will have more and more rooftop solar to finance. And in many countries where it cannot be done by the end consumer, there will be like private parties who will offer to invest in the infrastructure under PPA model. So you'll need to be able to aggregate all these projects and refinance them. Same challenge with the off-grid, as you mentioned, with the added complexity that off-grid models are not yet totally bankable, but it's the same idea. How institutions like us who are who can easily provide 20 or 100 million euro can deal with project size of 1 or 2 million euro, sometimes even less, and aggregate these projects. An increased demand for grid and interconnection to basically to deal with the intermittent renewable energy, and also interconnection to basically deal with the different climate in a same territory. So, for example, if the sun is shining in south of France, you still can rely on the PV solar energy produced there, while it's maybe not as windy or sunny in other parts of France. But at the same time, this grid will be less utilized because of the increasing decentralization. So how basically the cost of the grid, the tarification of the grid will need to change, and also you will need also to integrate much more grid investment, production investment, distribution investments to avoid stranded assets or congestion. So that's also a big challenge. Third challenge is how do you finance storage? Where do you put the storage? Do you put it with the renewable energy company so that basically they provide more reliable electricity to the grid? Do you put it with the grid operator? And at this stage, we need to basically test new models. Everybody agrees that storage is the solution, and the World Bank has recently announced a storage financing initiative, but still at this stage, the model still needs to be worked out.
Thank you very much. One important topic we are facing as infrastructure players is, international competition. When European infrastructure players are competing, against Asian players, for example, there's sometimes the need to have similar competitive financing as the one that a Japanese, for example, or a Chinese or a Korean company could secure thanks to their public banks. So a question for maybe more for Michel, Matthias, and also Jean-Philippe, Jean-Pierre is, what can we do? What can the Treasury do, for example, to help the infrastructure exporters get winning market shares in the international competition?
The Treasury itself has actually two types of tools to help exporters at large. It's not targeted towards infrastructure, but it can be used, of course, in this sector, either water, transport, or energy, or others, going either through grants of limited size or through loans. The grants are targeted, it's the FASEP, it's targeted to make some kind of ex-ante evaluation of demonstrator of what could be the project. And that could help a company to show that what it is planning could work on the field, and the Treasury also supports through loan, concessional, and direct loans to the firms in this field. But I need also maybe to mention the BPI France, which is a big player in this field, which is our one-stop shop company to help companies nationally, but also abroad. They are giving mainly at this stage guarantees, a bit like other companies, other public companies around the world, in order to help companies to export to the world. But there will be a new tool that is called GPS. It sounds probably familiar to you, but it's a bit different actually. In French, it's
Guarantee.
Guarantee. I can't remember.
Guarantee des projets stratégiques.
Something like that.
Yeah.
I find it. The idea is that usually when BPI France is guaranteeing a project somewhere on the planet, you need to have a share that is done in France of 20%. Here, if the French government will consider that the project is strategic, still to be defined, then BPI will be able to finance you wherever it is. And so this tool will be really, I think, make the financing costs for firms in France very competitive towards the competitors you were mentioning previously.
Okay, thank you very much. Matthias, do you think that we will see similar solutions from EIB or at the European level?
No. No, quite frankly, one short remark. I think that there are countries, including France, that are remarkably well positioned when it comes to export financing. I mean, we see it a lot when we finance projects with ECA support. I mean, the difference that makes, may this be German ECA, may this be Danish ECA, French ECA. The problem is that this is extremely dishomogeneous around Europe. I mean, you have countries who don't even have an export credit agency. And that, how are they actually then supposed to do their exportation and finance these? So I think, and this is without any preemption of what EIB could do, and I don't necessarily think it's a role for EIB, but it might be worth to come together and think about collateralizing this type of activity and helping Europe as a whole to actually access to an ECA platform that would allow, like, all members to develop their exportation capacities.
The European ECA.
Yep.
So EFD is providing finance to countries or government entities, etc. We have, I think that our main impact can be in helping the procurement and by building capacities. In many of our countries where we're working, the companies are complaining about the lack of good projects with adequate guarantees. And I think, and India is a good example, when you have a good procurement, NG, EDF, all these good sponsors will basically win market share. That's not an issue. Their request is help us bid the market in Africa and make an adequate procurement process. That's where we can help.
And that's where you're acting.
Yeah, exactly. That's the objectives, and in some countries the challenge is complex, and we need to build a coalition with the World Bank to make a solar project happen, for example. In other countries like South Africa, where basically a very robust procurement has been put in place, our role is more to finance the projects that the local banks are not comfortable with. So push a little bit the barrier and help innovation.
Okay, thank you. One question I have for you, Laurent, and for your counterpart at DBJ is, when you see a bank like Development Bank of Japan coming to Europe, what is your reaction? Are you happy to see a new liquidity pocket arriving in our market? What can you do? What can you do to help them? And I would like the same question to Mr. Rogge.
Okay. Of course I'm happy, and sometimes they come because I call them on behalf of the sponsors. So
you have a choice.
You're welcome. I think the fact that DBJ is willing and has already started to invest in infrastructure projects in Europe is a good thing. It's not an isolated move. I think it's part of a wider trend. And from, say, the bank's perspective, whether it's, say, purely banker-centric view, which is it's an opportunity, for further cooperation and as well as potentially manage our exposures and approach to infrastructure finance in a different manner. I think there is complementarity between our institutions. And if it's from a wider perspective, which is potentially not from an arranging perspective, but in a position where we are an advisor, I think we're of course also very happy because our clients, the sponsors, are very happy to see there's additional liquidity available. And if the dialogue is conclusive of the fact that the initial interest that DBJ can have on a conceptual basis can turn into actual investment of financing into infrastructure, well, I think it's win-win for everyone.
And Mr. Kuroki, can you, tell us what can we do as a financial center to, help your institution investing more in France and in Europe?
Thank you. So certainly, thank you for warm words to us. And then I certainly agree with Rohan's views in that we have a lot of area we can complement each other. So in terms of origination, we have a very much limited footprint in Europe. So certainly we need to get your support in terms of accessing good opportunity. Also, in return, we could potentially be acting a kind of a gateway for you to accessing a different type of capital, like a Japanese regional banks or institutional capital. And then, given the conscious of time, I don't touch upon much detail about what we are actively doing in this space. But when we try to match the gap, where you want to have some area of the opportunity, you want to get some capital in, and which is probably more innovative and a new thing, like energy transition or new thing for us. But our investors are primarily looking for the very much a boring traditional type of investment opportunity, like a PPP or availability-based opportunity. So this is certainly area of the gap we need to fill. So as a center of the infra, Paris, and then both from the public stakeholder, private people, we really get more knowledge transfer from you, how we assessing the project, how we can mitigate the risk, and then how we probably arranging the entire financing package so that our investor may potentially feel more comfortable to participating actively.
Thank you very much. So we have a few minutes left. I'd like to ask to each of you, in a very few words, what is, in your opinion, the key assets of Paris as a financial center? May I start with you, Michel?
It seems easy because it was already said by, I guess, most of the speakers.
Everybody, I agree.
I think it's the quality of both the environment and the team, probably. The environment with the fact that it was a long story of cooperation between the public and the private that has built that gathered teams here in Paris that are both good at the very beginning of projects, counseling, building the projects, but also building the project themselves, then financing. And this is this complementarity of all this systemic approach that makes Paris, I think, quite a good place to start with.
Matthias, from Luxembourg, what do you think?
It's an easy one, no? I mean, Paris and France is part of Europe. It's a motor of Europe, and it's an example for European integration. I mean, and that comes on top of all the technical qualities that Paris, of course, has, and all the savoir-faire, know-how that is accumulated here.
In in my field, I think Paris is a hub of, for climate finance. It was mentioned by Meridiam CEO, but also with the president launching the One Planet Summit. I think it's also make Paris extremely relevant on the climate finance agenda.
Okay, I'm going to take it from a different angle. What I'm thinking of, the main asset for this here, it's something that it takes time to build it, but does not necessarily need an EPC contractor or an infrastructure fund or even a bank. But I think it's just called quality of life. And if you want to attract people, that's part of it. And I think Paris is well placed for that.
So from the non-European investor perspective, I particularly focus on two particular sectors. One being is the sort of a rail transportation, or probably in France you have created a number of the high-speed rail concession a few years ago, just after sort of crisis. And then there's a number of the interesting model where the public stakeholder put a lot of the support to the private sector to encourage their participation. And then there's a difference of the model, one being the availability model, the other is more like a concession. So you've been very flexible. So this is something we can learn a lot from France. The other sector is slightly different, but obviously my colleague later today talked about the water concession. And this is the area we feel very interested. And then there is a lot of a similarity between France and Japan. And then you probably launch lots of innovative policy instruments where the operator is urged to putting more capital resources in enhancing the network by introducing new technology which make it more efficient, the environment friendly, and in turn create more return, I hope. So this is something we really very much cautiously looking at, and then very much looking forward to seeing it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know if we have time for questions.
Maybe one or two, maybe not more.
Okay.
There's one there. Are there any microphone in? No? Please. Yes, there is one there.
Hi, it's Marie-Monnier.
Please stand up
yes.
so that we can see you.
So,
and introduce yourself, please.
Yes, Marie-Monnier, Head of Regulatory in Natixis Bank. With the new regulation of Basel III revised, published in December, last December, the infrastructure financing is going to be more tough, a lot more. And in fact, it's going to push banks towards the most risky transactions. And notably for PPP, it will be very damaging. And so my question is the people of infrastructure aware of the fact that banks will have to reduce their financing, and also it will be very damaging for the best transactions, the infrastructure ones?
Thank you. Yeah, I think we are collectively aware. I don't know if you want to say a word, but yeah, I mean it's a point taken. I think we have.
We know the point, I guess. Yeah. So.
Okay, no, but I think the answer to your question is probably in the question itself, but also in the development of alternative solutions for infrastructure, like for example, the use of capital markets. Sure, yeah. There's another question from the gentleman.
The last one, because we're running out of time.
Ready?
Good morning. Chris Coles, the Capital Spillway Trust. All of you are talking about the infrastructure of offices and roads and railways, but are you giving enough thought to the investment gap that's already identified today by the European Investment Bank, how are you overcoming the infrastructure problem of supplying free enterprise equity capital to the startup business that you need to occupy those offices and employ people traveling over your infrastructure. But the one bit of infrastructure you seem not to be talking about is the need to supply the capital needs of the people that will use the infrastructure you're building. How are you overcoming that? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think we've seen a couple of initiatives now in favor of to develop, startup or, for example, EAB can provide subordinated loans, or most of the infrastructure funds in this market can provide also, equity to this kind of venture. So I think we agree that we need people to use our infrastructure, and some of these infrastructure companies are also started by nature.
Maybe I can give a French perspective here. Part of the response is probably, at least seen from this ministry, to increase the length of savings, notably of French households, so that in the end the funds could take more risks, and in that case can provide some sort of more equity form financing to firms. And this is one of the goals of the law that the minister is presenting at the very moment to the Parliament, the so-called Law Pact, which has some measures targeted to doing that, so to improve long-term savings of households.
If I understand the question correctly, it is not really about the equity in particular infrastructure projects, but rather for startup companies in general. So, and that is indeed maybe one of the biggest gaps that we see in Europe, continental Europe in particular, is that there is no real investment capital culture. That is something that is indeed something that will need to be changed if we want to keep up pace with other areas of the world. But that is a cultural change that will take a lot of effort to overcome. And it's true that Paris, as a future center, is probably challenged to think about exactly that particular piece.
Thank you very much. Well,
okay. Let me thank you, gentlemen, for your for this very interesting panel. Thank you very much indeed.